Good afternoon. My name is Dustin DePue, and I'm the Director of Museum Collections at the Pritzker Military Museum and Library. Welcome to another episode of our topic series, In the Armory, in which we explore the historical firearms in our collection. The museum and library is once again open to the public with reduced capacity and social distancing protocols in place. However, we will continue to offer virtual programming in an effort to keep our guests, staff, and constituents safe and healthy. In this webinar format, you can post questions or comments in the Q&A feed, and we will address those at the end. This program is being recorded and will be available on our website to stream. Before we begin, I would like to take a moment to thank our members and donors for their support of the museum and library. We are proud to be a part of your military history exploration. Today, we'll be taking a look at the world's first standard-issue semi-automatic rifle, the U.S. rifle caliber .30 M1, better known as the M1 Garand, and more often known as the M1 Garand. Any firearm enthusiast will have likely heard it pronounced both ways. The name is taken from the designer, John C. Garand, and there is strong evidence that Garand is how he pronounced his last name. It's a classic potato-potato scenario, though, and I'm not going to be the one to tell you how to say it. Besides, it's very likely I'll be saying Garand several times throughout this program without even realizing it. You could probably make a game out of that. Regardless of pronunciation, the M1 Garand is the quintessential American battle rifle. It wasn't perfect, but it was perfectly suited for the time. It was reliable enough for widespread use in combat, accurate enough to put effective fire down range, simple enough to train millions of soldiers to use effectively, and cheap enough to produce in tremendous quantities. General George S. Patton famously proclaimed it to be the greatest battle implement ever devised. It gave American soldiers a distinctive edge over combatants armed with bolt-action rifles and is forever associated with GIs from the greatest generation. If you've ever watched a movie or documentary about World War II, you probably recognize this rifle. The M1 Garand is 43.5 inches long with a 24-inch barrel and weighs 9.5 pounds unloaded. It fires the same .30-06 caliber round as the M1903 Springfield rifle that it replaced. It was officially adopted as the U.S. Standard Service Rifle in 1936 and remained so until 1958, when it was replaced by the M14 rifle. During that time, nearly 5.5 million were produced, with roughly 4 million of those produced during World War II. It holds 8 rounds in an internal magazine that is loaded from the top with a single 8-round en-bloc clip. It uses a gas-operated semi-automatic action and can essentially fire as fast as the user can pull the trigger. Before diving in any further, I think it's important that anyone with limited knowledge of firearms understands the very basics about how a semi-automatic rifle operates. In previous episodes, we covered the 2 main bolt-action repeating rifles used by U.S. troops in World War I, the M1903 Springfield and the M1917 Enfield. Both of these excellent rifles performed well under combat conditions and exemplified the technology of the time. But even as the war was ending, the U.S. Army Ordnance Corps was planning for a future in which bolt actions would be obsolete as a primary battle rifle. I have our M1903 Springfield rifle here to help demonstrate how a bolt-action rifle works. A bolt-action rifle requires the shooter to manually cycle rounds into and out of the chamber by turning a bolt to unlock the action, pulling it back, pushing it forward, and turning it back to the locked position. As the bolt is pushed back, the cartridge that is in the chamber is pulled out and ejected out of the action. As the bolt is pushed forward, it catches the next cartridge from the magazine and pushes it into the chamber. Turning down the bolt locks the action and makes it safe for firing. This process is repeated for every shot until the magazine is empty. A semi-automatic action eliminates the need for the shooter to manually cycle the bolt back and forth by automatically doing this after a round is fired at a much faster rate than a human. This can be accomplished in a variety of ways, but generally, gun designers use either the recoil energy, which is the equal and opposite force pushing back towards the shooter as the bullet is being pushed through the barrel, When you hear someone talk about the recoil or kick of a firearm, this is the force we're talking about. Or they use some of the excess gas generated when the gunpowder burns, gas that otherwise exits the barrel after the bullet. If you've ever watched a slow motion video of a gun being fired, you'll see this gas quite clearly. The M1 Garand uses a gas-operated system. We call it semi-automatic because it still requires the shooter to pull the trigger for every shot. A fully automatic action allows for multiple rounds of ammunition to be fired with a single pull and hold of the trigger. There are also select fire systems that fire a specific number of rounds for a single trigger pull, typically bursts of 2 or 3 rounds. So why did the United States switch to a semi-automatic action for their standard issue rifle prior to World War II, and why didn't everyone else? Well, first off, several semi-automatic rifles did exist at the same time as the M1 Garand, both in the US and around the world. But most of them were some combination of too expensive, too intricate, too delicate, or too unreliable to both be suitable for mass production and to survive the rigors of combat. Still, there were other semi-automatic rifles used by other nations in World War II, such as the Soviet SVT-40 and the German Gewehr 43, but neither were produced or issued in nearly the same quantities, nor as the primary battle rifle. One thing to remember is that designing a semi-automatic rifle to shoot heavy, high-powered rifle rounds while operating reliably enough to stake your life on is a very difficult process, especially at a time when it was an emerging technology. Add in that it has to be light enough to carry, durable enough to survive the harshest real-world environment that any firearm can go through, cheap enough to build millions of, and simple enough that soldiers can operate effectively under stress. That's a tall order, especially in wartime when you already have large stocks of reliable weapons proven during the previous war. Such was the case for most other nations in the late 1930s when war broke out. For once, the United States was ahead of the game in terms of firearm development. After being late to the party with its first magazine-fed bolt-action repeating rifle, the U.S. got a head start on testing and fielding a semi-automatic battle rifle with trials starting in 1922. There were 3 main competitors for much of this trial: the Thompson auto rifle, the rifle caliber .276 T1, designed by John Peterson, and the U.S. rifle caliber .276 T3, designed by John C. Garand. John Cantius Garand, there I go switching between the two, was a Canadian-born designer working for Springfield Armory. He had previously submitted a design for a light machine gun in 1917 that was approved by the War Department but couldn't be perfected before World War I ended. The Army recognized his talent and gave Garand a job as an engineer at the Springfield Armory in 1919, where he worked until he retired in 1953. Garand's design actually changed over the course of the 1920s, but the T3E2 is essentially an M1 Garand chambered in the .276 Peterson round, a round first proposed by John Peterson in 1923. The .276 Peterson was smaller and lighter than the .30-06 and undeniably easier to design for. It was still a high-powered rifle round, firing a 125-grain bullet at over 2,700 feet per second, but it was considerably less punishing on the mechanical parts of a rifle action. During trials, the .276 was looked at favorably by the majority of those involved in evaluating the rifles. By 1931, the trials had narrowed the field to just 2 models, the Garand and the Peterson rifles. In the end, funding issues forced a decision. Faced with the possible loss of funds already authorized by Congress, the Army, Navy, and Marine Corps Semi-Automatic Rifle Board met for one more time in January 1932 and decided to recommend approval of the Garand rifle in .276 caliber for limited procurement by the Army. With this action, the Peterson rifle was effectively dropped from consideration. The board's recommendation was sent to the Ordnance Board for approval, but before any approval could be made, the Chief of Staff of the Army, none other than General Douglas MacArthur, torpedoed the .276 cartridge with a letter to the board stating that the Army already had invested heavily in the .30-06 and that no further efforts should be made to create a rifle in a different caliber. Thankfully for Garand, a .30 caliber version of his rifle existed at the time and had been tested by the board. It was called the T1E1. This is what would become the M1 Garand. It would undergo several modifications throughout the 1930s, with the first production model successfully proof-fired, function-fired, and fired for accuracy on July 21, 1937. Production difficulties delayed deliveries to the Army until September 1937, and the Army wasn't fully equipped until 1941. The first 50,000 production guns also used a different gas system and are known as gas trap M1s. We'll touch on that later. In combat, the M1 Garand was praised by enlisted men and high-profile generals alike. General MacArthur, who first saw the M1 in combat during the Philippine campaign in late 1941 and early 1942, remarked that, quote, "The Garand rifle has proved itself excellent in combat in the Philippines. Under combat conditions, it operated with no mechanical defects, and when used in foxholes, did not develop stoppages from dust and dirt. It has been in almost constant action for as much as a week without cleaning or lubrication." During the Guadalcanal campaign, Marines got their first glimpse of the M1 in action in the hands of their rivals in the Army. The Marines were still mostly using the M1903 Springfield, which they generally loved, but they could not deny the advantages offered by the M1 and quickly worked to procure some for themselves at the Army's expense. In the book American Gun, Lieutenant Colonel John George says of his unit's M1s, quote, "We had to keep ours tied down with wire. Leathernecks were appropriating all they could lay hands on by moonlight requisition. In daylight, they would come over to our areas to barter souvenirs with the freshly landed doughboy units. Any crooked supply sergeant who had an extra M1 rifle could get all the loot he wanted." When Marines began to get a few Garands up to the front, the demand proportionally increased. They quickly learned that the M1 did not jam any more often than the Springfield, and that it was equally easy to maintain. Then there's the story of a Marine corporal of the 2nd Marine Raider Battalion, closely following an Army sergeant leading a platoon during the campaign. When asked why he was doing that, the Marine said, "You'll probably get yours on the first burst, Mac. Before you hit the ground, I'll throw this damn Springfield away and grab your rifle." There was similar praise in Europe, with Darrell Shifty Powers of the famous E Company 506th Parachute Infantry Regiment of the 101st Airborne, the man lauded as the best marksman in the unit in Stephen Ambrose's Band of Brothers, said, quote, "The most amazing thing about that M1 is you could throw that thing down in a mud hole, drag it through it, pick it up, and it would fire. What we did mostly was keep the outside of it clean as we could with a rag or something, and we'd clean the bore out as often as we could. Anytime we were off the line, we'd clean the rifles well. In combat, when you were right on the line, you don't take time out to clean the rifle. You just kept the mud and dirt wiped off the outside of it the best you can. They were outstanding weapons. That rifle worked all the time." Although we're focusing on the praise the M1 received as a combat rifle, it's important to remember that like all rifles, and particularly semi and fully automatic rifles, the success of the M1 in harsh environments was dependent on proper care and cleaning. In Korea, soldiers found that the guidelines for the application of lubricants to the moving parts could cause problems in extreme cold. Marine Theo McLemore said the trick to keeping the M1 working well in the cold was to remove all traces of oil and lubricant, which would freeze and jam the gun. Quote, "Not having any oil or grease was hard on the weapons, but removing it allowed us to use our M1s even when the temperature got down to 40 below. The M1 was our best weapon, and we really relied on those rifles." This echoes the sentiment of soldiers fighting in the sandy environments of North Africa during World War II, where any oil or grease left on an M1's moving parts would collect sand and cause malfunctions. A dry rifle was, and generally still is, more effective in cold and sandy environments than a well-oiled one. Modern M16 and M4 rifles in Iraq had the same problem in a sandy environment as the M1 did 60-plus years earlier. Despite the M1's considerable success as a combat rifle, the Army was already working on improvements to the design as early as 1945. Chief concerns about the rifle were its use of clips for loading and the 8-round capacity limit. During World War II, having 8 rounds of semi-automatic fire was a big advantage, but everyone could see that high-capacity, detachable box magazines were the future. There was also a desire for a select-fire rifle capable of firing fully automatic. This led to the development of the M14 rifle that would replace the M1 in 1959. But that's another episode, so let's take a closer look at the M1. Here is the M1 held by the PMML. Based on the serial number, at least the receiver was produced in 1942 in the Springfield Armory. It's a fairly beefy rifle, weighing 9.5 pounds unloaded, but it's surprisingly easy to handle, and the weight helps lessen the felt recoil. The rifle is consistently praised for being relatively soft shooting as compared to the 30-06 bolt-action rifles. I fired the M1 and I have to agree that it was surprisingly soft shooting compared to the 30 caliber bolt actions I've fired in the past. Let's take a closer look at specific features of the rifle. Starting at the butt plate, there is a small hinged latch on the back that opens up and holds the cleaning kit for the rifle. We know from the veterans I quoted today that keeping the rifle moderately clean was essential to its excellent performance. So this is an important feature for ensuring one's cleaning kit was always with the rifle. Moving forward to the trigger. The rifle had about a 4.5 pound trigger pull. One of the reasons the M1 was disliked by national match shooters early on was the fact that the trigger pull couldn't be lightened much more than this. M1903 triggers could be lightened to around 3 pounds, but there was concern that if the M1 triggers were lightened, that internal wear would cause the hammer to jar off the sear with the closing of the bolt, causing 2 or more shots to fire in rapid succession. It wasn't considered safe to go lower than 4.5 pounds. You can see the safety here inside the trigger guard. This latch is pushed into the trigger guard to engage the safety and pushed out of the trigger guard to disengage it. The trigger guard is also how you begin disassembling the rifle. I'm not going to do it today, but pulling this out allows the trigger assembly and magazine plate to be removed from the stock. Now we get to the action. To open the action, you simply pull back on the charging handle, and on an empty rifle, it's going to lock open. With the action open like so, the M1 can be loaded. This was accomplished using what is called an N-block clip. It would go in right through the top like this. This is a little different than the stripper clip that was used in the M1903 Springfield and M1917 Enfield that we looked at in previous episodes. Unlike the stripper clip, which is used to load ammunition but is then discarded, the N-block clip itself is pushed into the internal magazine. The M1 action is notorious for closing on one's thumb as the clip is being pushed into the magazine if you use improper technique, resulting in what is known as Garand thumb or Garand thumb. Yes, you can search YouTube videos for slow motion videos of this happening. It looks very painful. When the last of the 8 rounds is fired, the clip is discarded from the action. This generates a noticeable ping. Anyone who has seen Saving Private Ryan, Band of Brothers, or other World War II films or TV shows will likely recognize this sound. It was the source of much concern to anyone new to the rifle. In fact, this was one of the biggest perceived weaknesses of the M1, and on paper, it's certainly a disadvantage to have your rifle announced to your enemy when it's out of ammunition. From what I've read on the subject, however, it seems that in practice, the sound had no real effect on combat tactics. For one, the sound of the ping was often not heard during battle, either because the enemy was too far away or because it was drowned out by the deafening sounds of combat. Furthermore, a soldier was rarely firing alone, so even if an enemy soldier could hear that one rifleman was out of ammo, there were likely to be several other riflemen with loaded rifles. Also, an experienced soldier could reload the M1 in seconds, so covering the distance to charge an empty rifle holder was entirely impractical in all but the rarest circumstances. The rear sight is an aperture and is fully adjustable for both elevation and windage. The elevation knob is on the left side and is marked with figures from 2 to 12, representing 100 yards per number. Each click for both elevation and windage represents movements of 1 minute of angle, or 1 inch at 100 yards. It is calibrated for M1 ball ammunition, but works well enough with M2 and armor-piercing rounds as well. The sights were updated in 1947 with improved knobs for windage and elevation. The front sight is 0.07 inches thick and protected on both sides by metal ears so that the sight post won't get banged into things in the field. Let's move a little further down, and here you can see the bayonet lug, right here. The M1 bayonet has a slot that fits into this lug and locks in place, and a small loop that goes around the barrel. I'll demonstrate that for you right now. We have an M1 bayonet in our collection, currently in our Allied Race to Victory exhibit. Locks in right like that. You can see it rattles a little bit, but it otherwise holds. To release the bayonet, there's a little button here that you push, at which point the bayonet can come off, as seen here. While we're looking at the business end of the rifle, the M1 could also be fitted with the M7 grenade launcher, which fit over the barrel and allowed for the firing of special rifle grenades up to 250 yards. I mentioned earlier that the M1 is a gas-operated rifle, and here you can see the gas tube. When the rifle is fired, some of the gas generated goes through a small hole in the barrel, right here, which then pushes on a piston that pushes the operating rod and cycles the action, like so. The original gas trap models didn't have a hole in the barrel because John Garand didn't know how badly that could affect accuracy. Later, it was discovered that it had minimal effect and was in fact a better system. During the M1's service life, there were variant models, the most famous of which are two models fitted with a telescopic sight. The M1C, which saw some use in World War II and more extensive use in Korea, and the M1D, which had a slightly different mounting system. Even after being replaced by the M14, the M1 Garand continued to be used by both the United States and other countries. In the US, it saw some use in Vietnam in 1963, as it hadn't been completely phased out of the military yet. It also remained in service with the Army Reserves, National Guard, and the Navy into the early 1970s. Surplus M1s are also sold on the US civilian market through the Civilian Marksmanship Program. The M1 Garand is one of the greatest modern military inventions. Both the quality of its design and the timing of its creation gave American GIs the best standard issue rifle of the war. If you'd like to know more about this or any other military firearm, you can search the PMML's online catalog for books on the subject. This concludes my presentation. If you have any questions, or if you just want to sound off on anything discussed or anything I missed, please respond in the comments section. Thank you for tuning in. If you enjoyed this program and are looking for more engaging content, be sure to visit our website for a list of free videos on a host of thought-provoking topics. If you are not a member of the museum and library already, please consider becoming one today. Our membership community is vital to supporting the activities that help fulfill our mission and vision. Thank you for joining us.